We are very honored to have Serena Aunon with us today. And she just got back in December 20th of 2018. So she hasn't been back that long, so she's a great person to talk to about what's really going on up there, what's still going on up there. And so with that, I will pass it on over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for having me. Like you said, I just came down December 20th of last year. I turned over station to Ann and David, who just landed last night. Actually arrived back at Ellington last night, so it's kind of neat to see my crewmates safe and sound back on the ground. I'm going to show you a brief 7-minute video, which doesn't do justice to 197 days on orbit, but it gives you a taste of what our life is like, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. Great discussion as I walked in the door about quarantine especially, and my own personal thoughts. So I'm a practicing clinician. I'm an internist that still practices, and also an aerospace medicine specialist. And after being on station, I think one of the scariest things I thought about while I was up there was, wow, if there was a risk, luckily there wasn't, because we try as hard as we can not to bring viruses up to station. But if someone had a viral gastroenteritis on orbit, disaster. Because you don't know how much gravity helps you contain that down here. So there were several times, let me tell you, it is a dangerous operation nominally on orbit, going to the bathroom. Okay, so if you had something that was uncontrollable where it was coming out of both ends, and I've treated this plenty of times, what a disaster up there. I mean, you were really putting everybody at risk. So anyway, that was what came to mind immediately. I not only think about the pathogens that could be transmitted, but I think about the clinical outcomes of those pathogens, which are much harder to treat up there than they would be down here. All right, with that, we'll get started. I will talk you through this video so you know what's going on. So this is the cruise that I launched with, Expedition 56. We could bring the volume down just a little bit. Thanks. And only 3 names on that patch, and that's for good reason. I'll talk about that. We had spent 19 days in quarantine in Baikonur, Kazakhstan. We were walking out to the rocket in our pressure suits, saying goodbye to friends and family for the very last time. That bus takes us to the launch pad. Maybe just a little bit less on the volume, please. Then we get walked out by our administrator to the launch pad. They traditionally kick you in the butt and send you up the stairs before you get strapped in. And then you get ready for the ride of your life. You can bring the volume up just a little bit for this part. Building that's shaking. Okay, and then we began our 2-day ride to the station. We can bring the volume back down a little bit. That'd be great. Thank you. That's us inside. Those smiles are fake. We don't feel that good. But we do a good job for the camera. And then station approaches. It's massive. It's the size of a 5-bedroom house. People ask about claustrophobia. Nah, there's plenty of room up there to live and to work. This is what you see on the Russian docking monitor. We pulled in right next to Cygnus, who's actually on my right side of the window, and I thought it was awfully close. But we performed this maneuver automatically. You can see the thrusters firing off the Soyuz for that final approach. And then a successful docking. There is nothing neater than seeing your friends on the other side waiting for you, and that was Drew Feustel and Ricky Arnold and Oleg Artemiev. This is my Soyuz commander, Sergei, coming out for the first time into station. And then you'll see Alex Gers from Germany come out right after him, and Alex brought a little brown mouse from Germany with him. It's apparently a very popular cartoon character in Germany. And then you see me give Drew a huge hug, and then Drew just proceeds to get out of my way because I don't move very well and he doesn't want to get kicked. So he makes himself really small and just lets me do whatever I need to do. We get a couple days to rest, and then really the work begins almost immediately with the science. So what you're seeing are the cargo vehicles. Bottom left is HTV, Cygnus in the top right, Cygnus top left and Dragon top right and bottom right. These are all bringing critical science supplies to station. The hard part is unpacking these vehicles as fast as we can to get the science started. And there's a neat time lapse you'll see right here of us unpacking a vehicle. And that's so we really can begin the science. So what you'll see up here, upper right, is DNA and RNA sequencing. RNA sequencing performed for the first time on orbit during our expedition. Thank you, Sarah. Bottom right, ANGX cancer therapy. I loved working on that. This is just a tiny fraction of what we performed up there. I did get the pleasure of being able to grow plants, which was amazing on orbit. To see something green, to smell it. It's hard to explain when you live in a sterile environment like that to experience this sort of payload. This is our cupola. It's our window to the Earth. That's Alex's head you're going to see pop out here in a second. And I'll show you the view in a second that we see. But we are also guinea pigs up there, right? So we're getting as much human science done as possible. We get really good at it. But this is what we see every day. So flat earthers beware. The Earth is not flat. We get a gorgeous view as often as we want. We're circling the Earth every 90 minutes, sunrise and sunset every 90 minutes. This is continuation of the RNA sequencing that I took over from Ricky. First time I really pipetted was right up there on station. So yes, you can train people to do that. We had fun too. We tried to fit everybody into one crew quarters, and we made it for a brief period of time. And this is where we eat. This is the Node 1 galley. We eat upright, standing, so everybody seems like you're upright, but we get to play with our food, unlike most folks down here on the ground. So again, station is huge. Since assembly complete, we had actually harvested our first set of dragoon lettuce over a set period of 22 days up there in orbit. So we had a happy hour that just featured lettuce because we don't get anything else. It was fantastic. Alex is setting up the microscope here to do some Parkinson's research. We do a lot of medical research on orbit, and we had fun during Halloween as well. Sergey made a fantastic Russian Elvis. I have never seen better. And the views, people say, well, what did it look like? It's hard to describe. We do our best from up there, but the views are fantastic. This was on capture day for a Dragon vehicle. Alex and I were in the cupola. Well, as you know, in October of last year, it was a Soyuz that had a launch abort. Did not make it, and that was the next crew that was supposed to join us. The crew was fine, but the Russians very quickly had to turn around and make sure their vehicle was safe. And luckily, Anne and David and Oleg, and they just returned to Earth about 24 to 48 hours ago, were there to greet us. So we give each other big hugs. This is their first time ever in space. Anne is an Army helicopter pilot. David from the Canadian Space Agency, coming out now, is also a physician and an astrophysicist. He came into the Corps with me in 2009, and then finally their Russian commander. This is his 4th long-duration mission to space station. Most time in space out of all of us. We very quickly had to turn over how station works in 17 days, including all the science, and how to move, because we'd gotten pretty good by this point. The Russians did a spacewalk very quickly after that other vehicle arrived. We had 17 days before our crew went home, so we had to get the spacewalk done quickly. And it was an amazing view because it was right outside the window of the cupola. Very successful for them. They gathered all of the information that they needed from that spacewalk. And after wrapping up this activity, all of a sudden it was time for us to close the hatch, undock, and come home. Your vehicle undocks in about 3 to 4 hours, you're on the Earth. The view outside your window, that's about it. Plasma coming in. It's a very fiery reentry, and it's always a nice sign to see your parachutes deploy successfully. But the Russian search and rescue forces are there. They're circling the vehicle as it comes down. They pull you out. I didn't care that it was wintry and snowy. It was beautiful to smell the Earth again, and beautiful to come home, especially to my family. Okay, we can go ahead and cut it off. I'm going to open it up to questions. You can ask me about anything. As a physician, I'm pretty open about everything up there, including, what were our difficulties in performing science, where we saw certain challenges. But really, feel free to ask me anything you like. If I can't answer, I will. Who's brave enough to start? I will tell you from personal experience, this is my personal medical data, I had caught an upper respiratory, just viral infection prior to departing for quarantine. So I was already sniffly, it was miserable. And then midway through that 19 days, I caught a mild viral GI illness where I had diarrhea and just didn't feel good for 2 days and really had to lay low and orally hydrate quite a bit. So I was very thankful to have that length of quarantine. Now that could have hit at any time, and I know why I got that viral GI illness. In a sense, quarantine was broken a little bit. We decided to have a big barbecue with our instructors. So Now, I will say the Russians are really good on launch day. Everybody's wearing masks, everybody's wearing gloves. You do have people shuffling you around and touching you on your suit, but you're not really giving big hugs to too many people. They do try and limit that. Plus, the family members that are cleared to see you are screened every day for any sort of impending illness. Now, can you catch everything? No, but we had some of the same rules and regulations for shuttle. So Russians, I will say, keep it pretty tight. The lead physician in charge of quarantine, his name is Dr. Savin. We call him Dr. No, because anything we'd asked to do, the answer was no. And his job really was to keep the crew safe from any sort of illness. Now, the length of the quarantine, a lot of that depends on what we call the first fit check of the vehicle. That's when the crew gets in their vehicle with their suits and make sure everything is where it is. And that's all dependent on production. So it will never be below 2 weeks. It's usually 2 weeks or above, and ours happen to be 19 days. Yeah. We need a runner.
I know, I'm it today.
Are you it?
Can do that. Okay, so if you're designing a flight experiment, what would you advise to do and not to do to make it easier on the crew and more likely that the experiment would be successful? Biology thinking.
The biggest challenge we have on orbit is how well designed and implemented is the payload in the experiment. And for us, that's actually a lot of that's restraint. Are there Velcro pieces on every part that we need to tie down? Are the procedures clear and well organized? Have they been thoroughly vetted on the ground? Because we're given a very tight timeline. And so if the timeline says we get an hour and a half to do this, and you timed it to an hour and a half on the ground with very experienced personnel, it's probably not an hour and a half on orbit. When we were doing pipetting, we often got practice or training sessions. We'd just get one of them, but that was extremely valuable for us. Now, we're in direct contact with the PI on orbit, so we can ask questions at any time. They've got camera views, most of the time, multiple camera views, watching what we're doing to correct things, and so that helps tremendously. I honestly think we've gotten really good at organizing experiments, organizing that payload, and sending that payload to orbit, even with determining time lengths. I think the biggest for us, we loved just-in-time training videos. These are 3 to 4 minute videos you could send up. So the day before, I would watch it and say, what am I doing? Got it. Gives me a big picture. And then we can go from there. No, so how do we clean ourselves? It's actually, these are just, we have these towels that are in metal kind of foil packets with a little bit of soap embedded, and we just add hot water to it. There's no antiseptic that we use on ourselves at all while we're up there. Similar to down here, I use a bar of ivory soap or something else, but I don't use daily disinfectant to wipe myself off down there. Presumably, certainly with viruses, none of those should be up there. If we don't introduce them from the ground, meaning if we don't introduce anything really pathogenic up from the ground, most of the time we're fine. I'm not going to catch a common cold. I'm not going to catch adenovirus. I'm not going to catch norovirus. I'm not going to catch any of that while I'm up there because it was never introduced to station. So if we're worried about other bacteria that may become more pathogenic or increase virulence level or things like that, I still have yet to see clinical manifestation of that on orbit. So the research is interesting, similar to kind of viral reactivation. Some folks say, well, is everybody breaking out in shingles? No. Now, we do take some countermeasures towards that. We have certain vaccines that we get prior to launch, like, for example, Zostavax or Shingrix now. But we're not seeing a lot of the clinical manifestations. We're not seeing rip-roaring cellulitis. We're not seeing abscesses everywhere. But we really just wash ourselves with basic soap and water. Nothing fancy. Mostly because the chemicals are so highly screened by ISS, we can't bring them up there. Yeah, so worrying about medical scenarios on exploration class missions like a mission to Mars. Certainly folks have brought up, do you get prophylactic appendectomies or cholecystectomies prior to a flight like that? Not necessarily a crazy idea. I mean, if you're looking at how would we treat that? We have a pretty extensive medical kit on orbit. We have a host of antibiotics, both IV and oral. Not saying we can treat everything for a long amount of time, but we can treat a lot. I'm more worried about the vehicle doing something to the human. The humans we send up are pretty well screened for things like cardiovascular disease, you name it. We're scanned from head to toe in more ways than you'd ever want to know. So I'm worried about vehicle emergencies causing an illness, fire, causing inhalation injury, ammonia, so causing some sort of toxic atmosphere, depress event, causing a decompression type of sickness or some sort of embolic event. So we protect against that to a degree, but we can't protect against everything. A lot of our data, for example, appendicitis, has been looked at on long-duration submarine missions where they actually treated folks with high-dose antibiotics for a period of time, and a certain percentage did not go to surgery. So those are also things we look at, but do we have the answers yet? Not really. No. So really, we're looking at, even for a gateway, lunar gateway, which will be our kind of orbiting outpost around the moon, our size is already shrinking to other reasons, mass constraints. So to even recommend that we had some sort of area that you could possibly convert into a quarantine area is so low on the bottom of the priority list. They'll say mitigate with other means. That's what the program will tell you. They can't invest in something like that. I wish we could. Honestly, I would, as scary as that can be, if you had some sort of transmissible illness, I'm almost more worried about a solar particle event, and I would invest more in shielding for the crew against that sort of radiation. But it's a good thought. We just don't have the time, space, or money to be able to do that. Wish we did. Yes? Yeah, so I guess it's funny. The reason we didn't feel good was because of space adaptation syndrome. So we had already been out of our suits. The Soyuz, as it approaches station, goes into a solar spin. So it's doing this to maintain power. So if you think about it, it's like being in a centrifuge the entire ride, which is miserable, depending on where you are in the vehicle. You already don't feel well neurovestibular-wise. Your stomach's not great. So you add in that solar spin and you want to go leap off a bridge, which isn't going to happen. So, but you're right. The spacing, the crowding itself, certainly the Soyuz. So we were in that position for almost 7 hours because you're in that position 2 hours prior to launch. And then there's a very specific sequence of events that occurs before you're able to get out of your suit. And my hips and knees were screaming. I think station's huge, so we were spoiled. I mean, there's plenty of personal space, plenty of time to be by yourself and contemplate the meaning of life and how to laugh at all the flat earthers. So going to a much further destination in a much smaller vehicle has tremendous behavioral implications. More so, I think, so I did spend time at Nemo, and that was 17 or 18 days in a very small environment, really just, if you took one module of ISS, that's all we had. Funny enough, I didn't feel cramped at all. I always still felt, we had little ways to kind of curtain off personal space with Nemo. But I think you're right, it will play a factor on a 2.5 to 3 year long mission where you're looking at a transit out to Mars, you know, how long is your surface stay gonna be, and then transit back. How do we deal with that? I'm not sure. You can screen as well as you wanna screen, but it's kind of like you don't know what you don't know. And you just gotta kind of set off into the void and you know, put the best foot forward that you can. So I think it was interesting. We're not briefed on 80% of the science we do until we get up there. So, because we don't have time. We're learning about systems on the ground and how to recover those critical systems. So it's not till I get on orbit that I look at what science I'm going to be doing. And so in my mind, and this was my fault, I thought, well, because I'm interested in human research, medical research, what are we doing? I thought, oh, it's going to be basic, it'll be okay. I was wrong. So when I took part in the AngieX experiment, which looked at endothelial cell growth on orbit as compared to on the ground. It was great for me because I did get to interact with the PI almost every other day. I said, what are we doing here? And she says, you know, we have trouble culturing endothelial cells on the ground. They're growing in a flat plate. In a sense, they know they're outside of the living organism they're supposed to be in. They don't grow as well. But we hypothesize that on orbit, that's going to be different. That because they're in this sort of 3D environment, suspended environment, maybe they feel like they're in the body, and we can culture them for longer periods of time. And because of that, then we can test our chemotherapeutic agents and target the vascular supply of tumors. So to me, that was astounding, because a lot of the results that we saw preliminary validated that hypothesis. So what I took away from that was, wow, cells really do grow differently in microgravity. And what could we learn from that? by just eliminating that gravity vector, what else could we test? Protein crystal growth was the same thing. I was stunned because the scientists were so excited they were looking at the LRK2 protein, which is a target for Parkinson's disease, and all the information they were getting from that. And the way they explained it to me, and I explained it to people, is, scientists on the ground look at these proteins to develop inhibitor drugs against diseases, which have tremendous impact on people, not only in this country, but all over the world, but they get such limited insight into the protein structure itself. But by bringing it on orbit, they get 2 to 3 times more insight, and they can more finely tune that drug or make a better drug with fewer side effects. So that really impressed me. That's when I floated away, thinking, we are making a difference. This isn't stupid science. This does mean something. So basic biology, I think up there, and it was funny because I hadn't looked at a cell structure for so long. I asked the PI to send me up pictures because I was looking at the slide and she's like, well, we want to look at these foot processes. I'm like, whoa, I treat hypertension and diabetes. Can you remind me about the cell structure? And she sent me pictures, and so it was fascinating for me. I love that. And most crew do. It doesn't matter what their background is. I didn't get assigned that science because I was a physician. My timeline was open. It could have very easily been Alex, who's a geophysicist. So the more information we have about the science, we love it. It helps us do better for the PIs on the ground and helps us promote that science on multiple platforms, not even live downlinks, but social media. No. But I know Dwayne Pearson's back here, so we were just talking about some of the stuff and he had just alluded some of the stuff. I'm sorry, not Dwayne, Brian. I apologize. Your 2 names I go back and forth with because I used to deal with you guys all the time. But he was just talking about some new information that I did not know about regarding the immune system. So I think even similar to physiology on orbit, there are still things that are surprising us this day. There are some things that occurred during our flight that we saw in the human system that had not been noted before, not because it was the first time it had occurred, but we hadn't detected it. So the cool thing about aerospace medicine and physiology in the space realm, I feel like we've only scratched the surface, 20 to 30% or so. Mostly, I don't know. So that's part of the reason we're going back to the moon. We have to be able to develop this technology that is robust enough and sustainable enough to get us to Mars. So we have things that break all the time up on station. Now, station's old. It's like an older house, right? So we do a lot of preventive maintenance to prevent things from really crashing hard, but things still break unexpectedly. Now, I don't think we can develop the perfect system that's never going to break on an entire exploration class mission, but how do we develop procedures so the crew can fix it by themselves? Because the time delay when it breaks is 30 minutes. Right now when something breaks on orbit, when the toilet goes down, everything stops, right? Because we are fixing that. But we've got 200 people on the ground helping us to do that. Real time. We can talk to them real time, on the phone, on the open loops. We're very spoiled by the luxury of ISS. It will get harder and harder as we venture further out. So. There's never just one. So if I had to give you kind of my top 3 or 5, radiation's one of them. Behavioral is another one. It's going to impact everybody. Unknown physiologic phenomena that we just haven't encountered yet because we haven't had people up there long enough. I worry about pharmaceutical stability, which we actually had a big meeting about last week, 2-day long meeting to look at how do we get our pharmaceuticals to survive an exploration class mission length of time. I worry about bone loss still. We have not perfected that. We still see that even with current countermeasures. Folks come back with losses. Those losses span the gamut of not very much to 10% or so of their DEXA, but you're also changing the internal trabecular network of the bone. So now when you have folks up there for 1.5 years, 2 years, 3 years, now what are you doing to them? What does that do long term? So that's just a few things. So I think there's a lot of stuff we don't know, and it's just by virtue of the fact that we haven't had folks in space for very long and not for very long periods of time. We're getting that now, more and more. And we'll try and feed forward and extrapolate that data as best we can. But yeah, there's a lot that worries you. But there's a lot when we've strapped in the first folks to go to the moon or to launch period. And so it's just, you kind of work past them and do the best you can.
much.
You bet.
You're the best.
Yeah, thank you very
I
much.
really
Thanks for having
appreciate
me.
it.